All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dr. David Wallace, chair of the Berklee College of Music String Department, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to today's final visiting artist residency of the 2018-2019 cycle. And so we have today two very special guests, Ross Daly and Kelly Thoma. And as you can see in the Berklee String Department, we are one of the world's only departments that will accept any qualified musician on any stringed instrument. So as long as you can play and you want to study what we have to offer at Berklee, we warmly open our arms. So in our department, we've had all kinds of amazing instruments from different traditions, including Kemanche, oud, kanun, danbaritska, banjo, mandolin, tar, santur, sarangi, lauto, of course, to bring it to closer to where we are today. So many different instruments, and someone who has been really important for opening up a whole part of the world in our curriculum, as well as a master musician on so many interesting instruments and is able to help students from different traditions, is our professor, Beth Bahia Cohen, who will give a more elaborate introduction to Ross and Kelly, who will be with us today and tomorrow. Beth.
Thank you. Sorry. So I would like to tell you about Ross and Kelly, and I'm going to read if that's okay. Ross Daly, composer and multi-instrumentalist, has traveled the world, mainly in the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent, studying various forms of local music traditions. In 1982, he established the Labyrinth Musical Workshop, which since 2002 has been situated in the village of Houdetsi on the island of Crete in Greece. Weekly seminars and master classes are conducted every year, mainly in the summer at Labyrinth, with some of the greatest teachers of traditional music from around the world, mainly from Turkey, Greece, and Iran. Labyrinth has become the hub for musicians worldwide to learn, compose, and perform modal and traditional music. There are now several Labyrinth satellite workshops in Italy, Spain, Toronto, Cyprus, and hopefully more to come. Ross Daly has released more than 35 albums of both his own compositions and his own arrangements of traditional music that he collected during his travels. Ross originated the term contemporary modal music, which refers to contemporary compositional works which draw their influences and inspiration from the broader world of modal musical traditions which are found in the vast geographical region between Western Africa and Western China. Ross Daly has been an inspiring role model for thousands of us who are interested in learning, performing, and composing from modal music traditions. For myself, hearing an early recording of Ross Daly's was the spark that propelled me to Istanbul to begin my own study of Turkish music, and for that I am very grateful. Kelly Thoma was originally a lira student of Ross Daly's, and in 1995 she became a member of his group Labyrinth, which had her traveling and performing throughout Europe, Asia, Australia, Canada, and the US. Involved in projects with musicians from various countries and various traditions. She's also a member of the Labyrinth Musical Workshop. Kelly plays the lira with sympathetic strings and has released 3 albums of her own compositions. And we have a surprise guest, Michael Harris, who will be joining Ross and Kelly. He plays upright bass, he's a composer. He plays yaylı tambur and sarangi, and has been performing with Ross and Kelly on their US tours for the past several years. So, it is both an honor and pleasure to have them with us today. Please join me in welcoming Ross Daly, Kelly Thoma, and Michael Harris to Berklee College of Music.
So, good day to you all. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be with you all. I'd like this meeting to be sort of as open as possible. I'd be very interested to hear your perspective on various things as well, and whatever questions you might have. I think we'll just start by playing you a few pieces, a couple of pieces, you just get a musical introduction to what we do, and then we can speak about some of the things which hopefully will be of common interest. So, I don't know, I suppose some of you will of course know these instruments. This is called lira. It's a type of upright folk fiddle used on the island of Crete, but there are various different types of it as well. I mean, there's a lira found also in Bulgaria, where it's known as kadulka, which is a bit similar to these ones here. In Turkey, there's the kemençe, which is used in the music of Istanbul primarily, which is a very close relative of this. And also you find it in various regions of Serbia, Bosnia, and all of the Balkan Peninsula there, in different versions, and also in South Italy, where it's used in the region of Calabria. So the lira is basically, in its original form, it's a 3-string upright fiddle, and the 3 strings are played not by pressing them like you do on a violin, but by pushing the nail to the side of the string. That's the way we produce the notes. These particular ones include the use of a large number of sympathetic strings, which give them a sort of a slightly different sound and a slightly different presence of sound, so to speak. That's something which you find on liras in Bulgaria, for example, and then I found a way of adapting sympathetic strings to the lira of Crete, based somewhat on the Indian system as they would be used on the sarangi, which is again a fairly close relative of the lira. So we have different types of liras here which we use. And then there's this rather strange looking thing, which it's a contemporary instrument. It was designed by an Australian luthier called Peter Biffin and myself together. It's loosely based on the Cretan lira, because what Peter does is that he makes instruments with cone resonators. And so inside this, in there is a very, very fine wooden cone, like the cone of a loudspeaker, basically. And that's what produces the sound. It doesn't have a soundboard like most other instruments would. So I asked the luthier to make it. So that the string length here is 29 centimeters, which means that I can play it as a lira. But I told him to include 5 strings instead of just the 3, so I'd have a larger range. Because the cone resonator does enable you, with a rather small size, to produce a very large range of different tones. On a traditional soundboard, there is a limit. You cannot go below a certain frequency, otherwise it just doesn't respond very well. So to produce a very low frequency, you'd have to make a much bigger instrument. Whereas with the technology of the cone resonator, even quite a small cone can produce a very, very low frequency. So that was the idea behind that. Then the sympathetic strings are just twice the length of the playing strings, because as we all know, sympathetic strings work much better the longer they are. So that's the basic idea behind this instrument, really. And it uses multi-filament strings, which they were originally strings made of horsehair, rather like on the Egyptian rababa or the various instruments like igil or morinkur of Central Asia, of Mongolia. But with the horsehair, it was completely uncontrollable, the tuning of it, because even the friction of the bow would produce heat, which would put it out of tune. So I started to use a nylon variant of that. So these strings are basically made out of various gauges of fishing line. So that's how it works. So we'll start by playing a couple of pieces for you, and then we'll continue talking. a piece which is based on a Cretan form known as sirtos, which is a dance form from the west of Crete. It's a new composition, but based on that particular structure. So I can show you just a brief example of how some of the Cretan melodies are structured and how we actually work with them. Like in many traditions, the Cretan melodies or Cretan pieces would be very much sort of A-B constructions, or they can be A-B-C-B or A-B-C-D. They have various different sort of structures. So I'll show you a very, very simple one, which is it's just an A-B structure. So each of the phrases can be either 2 bars of 4/4, 4 bars of 4/4, or 3 bars. And it has to go with a dance form, sorry, which is 11 steps, but which fits into a cycle of 16. So if you have 4 bars of 4/4, you play the melody once and it fits exactly into the dance circle. If it's 2 bars, you play it a double number of times, 2, 4, 6, 8. And if it's 3/4, you have to play it 4 or a multiple of 4 for it to work out properly with the dance. So I'll just show you one very simple piece and then what we actually do with it. So this is its first phrase, just 4 notes, that's all it is. That's it. That's 2 bars, so I have to play that 4 times. So. Getting boring. Okay, now we can go to the second phrase. That's 4 bars, so I can play that as many times as I like. But as I said, playing even that very simple little first phrase 4 times gets quite boring. So we have to find something to do with it. So we have to ornament it. So this is what we would actually do with it. We include trills or different little rhythmic variations. You get this. Second phrase. That's how we would embellish it. I can also show you how these little phrases, most of which are very, very simple, and we try and break them down into their simplest possible form so as to have something to work with. And each lira player would embellish these melodies in quite his own way. It would not be a sort of standardized way which would be copied from one to the other. Of course, when you learn from your own teacher, you have to learn the whole repertoire of embellishment as your teacher does it, but then you're not expected to stay there, you have to go on from that. So let me show you a very basic piece, what happens to it, and through the process of variations. So here's perhaps the best known melody of the west of Crete. It goes like this. This melody is 3 bars of 4/4, so you have to play it 4 times for it to fit with the dance properly. So I just played it 4 times. Then we can go on to the second phrase, which is 4 bars, and you can play it as many times as you like. That gives you an idea of what we do as embellishment techniques for these very, very simple melodies. And so each musician, each lyra player would develop their own repertoire of different ways of embellishing these melodies. So what we then, once you've developed your own style and your own repertoire of embellishments, what you then look for are very, very simple melodies on which to apply these techniques. So what also happens, however, is that through embellishment and different things like that, sometimes these melodies start to change and they start to shift into completely new pieces. So I'll take you through a sort of a guided tour of this melody, where it ended up. So as I showed you originally, it was played here. In this position from E. Someone moved it over a string, and it acquired a different character, so that it became embellished a bit differently. It sounded a bit different. So it now becomes this. Someone decided to lower the second degree. Changes quite drastically. Now raise the third degree. Okay, so then somebody decides to change its position once again. So, go back to what we had in the beginning, which was this. This gradually becomes this. That gives you a very brief idea of more or less how melodies of that particular type happen to work, and they sort of gradually move along, they get more and more embellished, and they turn into to a new piece. So that produces that's very much the way in which new compositions actually occur, and it's one of the reasons why it's a little bit difficult to actually say that this is my or yours or his composition in any way, because when the form itself is actually dictating more than half the composition, it becomes very, very difficult for someone to say that this is their own personal composition or something like that. It's something which sort of comes out of a process much more than out of what you might call an individual effort. So this is sort of a problem which we encounter all the time in various different types of traditional music, not just on Crete. That people often want to know who composed this or who composed that. It's very often not quite that simple. I myself encountered in my own work with these different musicians that quite often when one of them would say that this is mine, they would actually mean not necessarily that I have composed this from nothing, but they might mean one of four different things. Either that I put this lyric with this melody, or I recorded it first, or I'm considered to be the best instrumentalist of my region, so everything is attributed to me. Modest people, huh? Yeah. Or the fourth possibility is, indeed, he composed it. Which that does happen as well, of course, because a lot of these things are being created today, a lot of new material coming out. So we'll try a different style, something else for you to listen to. is a composition in the semi form, which is very commonly used in the music in the urban music in Turkey, but also in the Arab world and other countries as well in more recent years, especially in Greece also. For those of you who are perhaps not familiar with it, it's a form. It has 4 basic sections. The basic rhythm is a 10/8 rhythm, divided 3/2/2/3, and the final section is usually in a 6/8 rhythm, and you start out in a basic maqam, and then in each of the different sections, which are called hane, you change and you go into a different maqam, showing the relations between them. It's sort of important for people to see. I mean, quite often in the Western world, people tend to analyze maqams and modes as being scales, which is actually not quite correct. Especially in the Middle Eastern idioms of maqam or dastgah, as you find it in Iran, or even raga in India. The modes, maqams, dastgah, raga, or ichos in Greek, much more than scale material, they're actually phrase material, and that's very, very important. I remember myself in my early years when I was started to study this particular type of music, I read just about every theory book I could put my hands on, which was in a language I could understand at any rate. And I remember reading all about these sort of different scale structures in these theory books and perceiving everything as more or less scale structures. And this never actually did translate into music. It never really worked. And it was only after I encountered musicians who actually play this tradition and who were able to show me that the most important aspect is the phrase material, and that in order to learn the maqams or the different modes, you have to play a lot of repertoire, a lot of material in each of these modes, and acquire gradually a phrase material which will be relevant to what you do, and which will actually give it a certain coherence. I often use 2 specific examples to help people to understand this a little bit better. One is an example given by an Iranian musicologist called Hormoz Farhad, who stated that, okay, if we have a line from point A to point B, and let's say that point A just represents tonal material, scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do, for example, and point B represents a fully fledged melody, a fully composed melody, said all maqams are somewhere on the line in between those 2, which is fairly accurate. But perhaps even more accurate is another example which I give, which is getting to know maqams or modes is a process very much like getting to know people. Let's say I don't know Mike here. Let's say I don't know him. And somebody gives me a piece of paper with a description of him, and it has 10, 15 basic characteristics. He's quite tall, he has hair this color, eyes this color, he's quite thin, he's not fat, and he's very sort of descriptive qualities. I could go into a crowd of 100 people and I'd look and think, well, maybe it's this one over here, maybe it's that one over there, I don't know, not quite sure. But because I know him, I can go into a crowd of 1,000 people. Oh, there's Mike. The recognition is quite immediate. And of course, all this information on the piece of paper, it's quite true, there's nothing wrong with it, but the recognition does not come as a result of that. It's something much more immediate and something which is not just the product of a description given to you by somebody. And it's very much the same thing with maqams. You have to get to know them rather like you get to know people. And the way to do that, of course, is to play through a lot of the repertoire and to listen, of course, to a lot, to what is played by, we have access to a lot of recordings, fortunately now, much more than when I was learning at any rate. In those days we had little cassettes which would be shared secretively amongst us. Today you have YouTube and all sorts of other things. And it's very much a process of playing many, many compositions and acquiring phrase material and acquiring a certain sense of phrasing, really, which is very relevant. And of course, listening to improvisations, listening to singers, I think, is also very, very important, because they have a very specific way of phrasing, which is connected to breath, which is also quite important. I was told by my own teacher in Turkey for kemençe that the bow on the kemençe should follow the pattern of the breath of a ney player, which was a very relevant piece of information. Whereas in other traditions the bow would work quite differently, of course, but yeah, that's another side issue. Yes, so what's most important in any of these traditions is to acquire the phrasing. You'll probably encounter all sorts of theory books which are written about maqams, and you'll meet some musicians who will be very, very erudite about all the little details of maqams and things. But it's important to bear in mind that this is actually a tradition of music which has resisted theoretization for over 1,000 years. People have been trying to put it into little boxes and make a theory out of it, which is neat and coherent. But it always resists that process, and it insists on remaining a very, very idiomatic tradition in many ways. This brings us to the question of the fact that this music is often referred to as classical music. So we come to this rather sort of sticky question. Okay, in the West we have something which we call classical music, Beethoven, etc. Okay. But then we suddenly discover that, well, Turkey also has Turkish classical music. The Arabs have Arabic classical music. There's Uzbeki classical music, Uyghur classical music, North Indian, South Indian. Everybody seems to have classical music. Great. And then you start asking the question, well, what do they actually mean by that? What does this word classical actually mean? And some people will say that, well, it refers to where you have a tradition where the composers are known specifically, where they're specific people, composers. But in any tradition which I know, we know pretty well who composed most of the pieces. Then there's always a repertoire which comes from the distant past, which is somewhat anonymous. So that's not applicable. Other people would say, well, to be classical music, it would have to be based on some sort of a specific theoretical system. It'd have to have that underpinning it. Well, okay. But again, any music which I know, which is all maybe described as folk music, in its own way, it always has some way of describing what they're doing. So, which you could basically call it a sort of a theory or a system which underlies it. So that also doesn't seem to work as a definition. What I then started to wonder was this. Let's say that I go up to an Italian classical musician and say, what is your music? What do you play? What would you consider to be your music? And he would say, well, my music, it's Vivaldi, Italian, Grieg, Norwegian, Beethoven, German, Tchaikovsky, Russian. And he would mention all these different names of composers who compose things which he would like to play. And they're all from very, very different traditions and very, very different countries. Okay, interesting. And then you would go, for example, to a Turkish classical musician, and you would say, what is your music? What do you play? And he would say, oh, my music is Tambur Cemil Bey, it's Mustafa Itri, it's Dede Efendi, it's maybe someone like Zakaria Hanande, maybe someone like Tatios Eksercan, but all within the sphere of the former Ottoman Empire or the contemporary Turkish state. Oh, okay. So if you were to ask him then, well, do you not play maybe Iranian composers or Arabic music? No. That would be betraying our tradition. Ah, interesting. So this is where I see a big difference. And of course, when you look at the history of any of these different musical idioms, it's not quite that simple. All of these musical traditions developed under the umbrella of large empires, the Ottoman, the Byzantine, the Persian, all different empires which existed at different times. So there was a lot of intermingling of these very rather different people. And because of that, music tended to develop regionally and not nationally. So you would find people living in the same region playing very much the same idiom, really. That was the sound of their particular region. And it would not necessarily be that this is the music of Turks, this is of Greeks, this is of Arabs, or this is of Persians. The only distinguishing feature which tended to lend a lot of specific sound or color to things would be the difference in language. And that the difference in language, especially when many of these traditions have a very strong song basis, the difference in language does actually impose quite significant differences in the music itself, in the rhythm, in the emphasis, in the whole sort of what you might call pronunciation of it. But still, all of these different idioms were very, very seriously influenced the one by the other. And the end result is that you end up with a myriad of different musical traditions in the huge geographical area, stretching, as Beth said previously, from northwest Africa right up until western China. And this is the whole area in which we find the majority of the world's modal musical traditions, or at least modal traditions in the Eastern sense of the word. And all of these traditions are intertwined, they're interconnected, they have influences the one on the other. We do, however, live in a region of the world where we happen to live. It's smack in the middle of the Mediterranean and on the island of Crete, which is in a region of the world where we have a number of contemporary nation states with extremely ancient names. Greece, Egypt, Israel, Syria, Iran, or India, or any of these names. They're very, very ancient names. But as state entities, they're all much younger than Australia, which produces a rather uncomfortable situation. And what happens is that each one of these individual nation states, which nation states in this region of the world are somewhat unnatural in many ways. But that's another issue, a political issue, which we won't get into that one now. That's very sticky. But on a cultural level, what happens is that each of these nation states now wants to establish a national culture of its own, which it wants to associate with and to connect with its distant past, or what it perceives to be its origin. So in the case of Greece, we quite often hear the sort of the what you might call the official line is that everything in Greek music comes from ancient Greece through Byzantium down to the contemporary Greek musical idiom, without much influence from left or right. The Turkish line is everything comes from Central Asia. The Iranian line is that maybe even Beethoven's Ninth is an old Iranian folk song, or all sorts of things. Each one tends to want to sort of ascribe everything to themselves. And they want to see the, what you might call the masculine influence of their culture, that which exerts influence on others, and they tend to underplay the feminine aspect of their culture, which is accepting from others. This, however, produces a rather bad situation, because without the balance between these two things of give and take, when you're always just dispersing something and never taking something, then you sort of run out. And this is what is actually happening, unfortunately, today in many of these cultures, is that they're ignoring what's going on next door to them, and they're all now perceiving as progress further along in their own tradition nothing more than a simple process of westernization. And this has produced some rather sort of strange results in many fields. Especially those of you who are familiar with the Middle Eastern idioms like Turkish or Arabic music, or Iranian music as well. You're well aware of the fact that these traditions use a number of intervals which are not found in Western music and are not in any way conducive to the imposition of what we refer to as Western harmony. But what is happening gradually is that this is being imposed on them, even in some cases through the imposition of state propaganda or state cultural policies, that they must westernize everything. Certainly that happened in Greece in the early 20th century and mid-20th century. There were official policies which forbade you to use Oriental scales. And a similar thing has happened in Turkey as well in the beginning of the 20th century. So there was this gradual process of forced westernization, which has continued into the present day, no longer through force or anything. That was no longer necessary. They do it of their own accord now. But I do remember myself in the early 1980s when I was studying lira on Crete with my own teacher, Kostas Mundakis. And I was simultaneously studying kemençe with İhsan Özgen in Istanbul. Both these instruments are variants of the lira. They're different types of lira. On Crete, nobody had any idea that people in Istanbul played lira. In Istanbul, nobody had any idea that people on Crete played lira. And neither had any idea that people in Bulgaria played lira, or in South Italy, or in Serbia, or in Bosnia, or in Croatia, or in any number of other different places. But everybody at that time knew very well Michael Jackson's latest hits, which I always found that to be somewhat tragic. That these different people who have so much to share with each other and so much to learn from each other were not actually paying attention to one another, but they were very much focused on anything coming from the Western world. And that influence was coming primarily not due to the fact that it was anything better, but simply that it came from economically rather more successful region of the world. So it was not really a musical issue at all. So what we do, our educational project known as Labyrinth on Crete, it's very much focused around that, really. The meeting and sharing of musicians from this huge world of modal music amongst themselves and learning from each other and sharing what they have. And out of that come all sorts of new projects, which I find them particularly interesting, that we find young musicians from these various different cultures, which are already interrelated anyway, finding new common ground and composing and creating new music. So this has led to the necessity to sort of come up with a term, basically, which is to describe this, because very often I found that, well, for example, on Crete where I live, if a young lira player who played the Cretan lira in the Cretan tradition and everything, if he suddenly found himself playing with a Turkish balama player and maybe an Iranian tar player or an Afghan rabab player, that the people in the local tradition would look rather down on this, and they would think, oh, this isn't good. They were sort of bastardizing things. So this is the word they actually use. And that, this is somehow illegitimate. And I always found this to be most unfortunate, because I see this as a completely natural process, which is nothing more than a continuation of what's been going on for literally thousands of years anyway, and has been sadly interrupted in the last about 150 or 200 years through unmusical considerations. So that's what we do there. And it also occurred to me that on this whole question of what people like to refer to as classical music, whatever that term may mean, there was something I found which is interesting, which is that the European classical musician who will play music from composers from any background, really, and today that includes Koreans and Vietnamese and Chinese and not just Europeans. This I found to be particularly interesting, because in many of these cases, the composers from these different countries, they would use elements from the traditions, their local traditions, and this would all grow into this large body of music which would be able to take influences from just about anywhere. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Just to look at Europe alone, without incorporating all of this other, just in the past, it's been very important that all of these people have a type of music which each one of them is able to consider as our own, and it's shared. This is very important, and this is something which did actually exist in the Middle East, in the Balkans, in Central Asia, in Transcaucasia, in many different regions, but has unfortunately disappeared within recent decades. And so there are a number of people today who, because music is no longer as regional as it once was, because we ourselves are not as regional as we once were. We're not confined to one specific place. We do a lot more traveling than people in the past, and we have a lot more experience of different lands and different peoples and different environments than people in the past would have had. So I know a number of composers today who are working very, very seriously with, you can see in their music influences coming from Greek music, influences coming from Iranian or from Indian music or from any number of different modal traditions. And we decided to use this term contemporary modal music to describe that. I know it's not the best of terms, but it's a bit unwieldy. But I was particularly concerned in coming up with this term to get us out of the sphere of nationality and nationalism and all this sort of stuff, which has played such a negative role in each of these traditions, and also to highlight the contemporary dimension of this music. People are often under the mistaken impression that when you hear the music of Crete, because the official line likes to ascribe everything to antiquity, they think, Cretan civilization goes back 4,000 years, okay. So what we're hearing now is a reflection of what went on 4,000 years ago. Absolutely incorrect. Or the Indians will tell you, our tradition is 6,000 years old, And so you listen to an Indian musician today and you think that this is some sort of a reflection of some antiquity or something. Again, quite incorrect. I can think of very few traditions in the world today which have made the enormous leaps and bounds of progress that has been made in North Indian music over the last 70 years. But everyone seems to ignore that, wanting instead to accentuate the antiquity and the fact that this is coming from a long time in the past, and sadly ignoring the contemporary creativity that's gone into this, which is enormous. And I can think of a lot of different examples of that in many of these different traditions. So we wanted very much to emphasize the contemporary dimension, the fact that there are people today doing extraordinary things, wonderful things, at least equal to what's been done in the past. So that's how we managed to come up with all of that. And that's sort of what we're focused on in many ways, is accenting the sharing of knowledge from various different traditions within the world of modal music, so that people can go forward without having just to sort of quite simply westernize everything, but go forward with their own material, which for me that's always been very important. So having said all of that, I'd like to open it up to some sort of discussion with all of you. So if anybody would like to say something or ask a question about this or anything else, you're most welcome to, okay? The only problem is I can't see you because of these lights.
Perhaps some more music.
Okay, fine. Fine, maybe. say only yourself,
Good
yes.
question. The instrument has two pegboards.
Yes, yes.
How exactly does that work? I just
Well-
saw another instrument that had two pegboards
Yes.
this weekend.
Yeah.
The Arabo?
Theorbo,
Yeah.
Theorbo,
So
yes, yes.
amazing.
Yeah, this is different from the theorbo, of course. Not entirely. What happens is that there's 5 strings here on the top layer, and they're governed by these 5 pegs here. And there are 12 sympathetic strings running through the neck, and they're governed by these 12 pegs up here. So so these strings are much longer, and they're running underneath the fingerboard here, and underneath the bridge. And they're balanced by there's pressure coming from the top of the bridge pressing down, and pressure coming from underneath. And there's a little bar at the back here which I can raise or lower, and that will govern the amount of pressure to make sure that it's correct in relation the one to the other. So that they're basically governing different sections of strings on the instrument, which on a theorbo would be the same thing. There's the lute part of it, which is the one part where it's actually fretted and played, and then there's the very, very long drone strings which it has going up to the top. It's used in medieval music for continuo, for the accompaniment. Yes, yourself.
Yeah, hi. You said before about the music in the western part of Crete. What are the differences between
Yes.
the western and the eastern part of the island? And are there any differences in the instruments that they mainly use in those parts?
Are there any differences in the instruments?
Yes.
Yes. Well, yes. Crete, even though it is an island, it's quite a big one. So that means that there are different sections. It's also very, very long as well. So from the west to the east, it's about 350 kilometers, which is quite a distance. So the style of music played in the west of the island, around the city of Chania and that province there, is quite significantly different from that played on the east end or Lassithi. Even the forms and the dances and everything are quite different. As for instruments, there were a variety of different instruments in use on Crete. Up until the 18th century, there were no string instruments actually in the local folk music. They were primarily wind and percussion instruments at that time. And from the 18th century onwards, the lira seems to have appeared. Well, that's when we first see written mention of it at any rate. Even though liras themselves did exist in the northern Greek and Turkish region of Thrace since the 10th century, when they were first mentioned by a Persian traveler known as Ibn Khordadbih, who mentioned that the peasants in that area played an instrument called lura. And that's probably a reflection of the different pronunciation of the Y letter at that particular time. But no, on Crete they appeared rather later, the 18th century really. There are certain regions on the far west of Crete and on the far east of Crete where they prefer the violin to the lira. Specifically in the Chania province in the west of Crete, they would play violin, or in the Sitia region of the east of Crete. That's fairly recent. The violin came to Crete. There are mentions of it in the 19th century, but I think the majority of the violin tradition actually did spring up within the beginning of the 20th century. We also had other instruments. There was an instrument rather like the saz, like the balama, which was known as Bulgari, which was used primarily in the cities, in the harbors of the 3 major cities, Chania, Rethymno, and Heraklion. We also have a type of, in the center of Crete, we have a type of bagpipe known as askomandura, which almost died out entirely, but in recent decades has been making sort of a comeback in a way. There was a small percussion instrument on the west of Crete, no, the east of Crete, sorry, known as daouli, which was very small, not a large one, a small barrel drum in a way. And there were various types of folk flutes known as spirochabilo or theaboli, or different folk flutes of that nature. So those are the instruments found primarily on Crete. Anybody else? Yes, yourself.
This instrument, you're using
They're synthetic, yes, because the horsehair was so sensitive to heat and damp that they would go out of tune with the slightest. Yeah, so they're now made of nylon, a very fine nylon fishing line, basically.
And have you tried that on the lira as well?
I haven't, no. It's something I've been meaning to do for quite a while, actually. But I'd love to try it one day. I'll have to get around to doing that. Yeah.
And you said you got the idea from Iggy?
Well, I got the idea. I mean, there are various instruments. I think perhaps the first instrument I encountered of that type was the Egyptian rababa, which is used in the Saidi music, or from the Turkish rabab also, which used to use a horsehair string for the first two strings. Also, we did work many years ago with musicians from Tuva who played igil, and so we saw them using these type of strings as well. And that sort of refreshed my memory somewhat about horsehair strings. I tried initially with horsehair strings on this, but they were just impossible to control the tuning. Yeah.
Additional for which one? For the synthetic or?
But no, for the playing strings. The sympathetic strings are simple steel strings or wound steel strings. But for the playing strings, I would use for the last four, should I say, I would use the horsehair. For the very, very high one, it doesn't really work with the horsehair. So I used a viola string, the top string of a viola. And the other ones are made of different gauges of nylon now.
Could you remind us the name of that?
This instrument was called Tarhu by its original maker, Peter Biffin. If you're interested in more information on it, you can look on the website at www.spikefiddle.com. That's the website of Peter Biffin, who made the original ones. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the fishing line, do you have many together?
You have to have many together, yes, and it's important that they not twist. They must run parallel to get a good sound. Otherwise, they get very scratchy and rather ugly sounding. So that's rather difficult to do, actually, to keep them all parallel without twisting. And also, when you make the string, there's no way that you can actually ensure that they will all have the exact same tension. So some are slightly tighter, some are slightly looser. But still, when you tighten them up, they produce one sound. I've never understood why that happens, but anyway, it does. So that's why on this instrument, the older the strings are, the better they are. Because as you tighten it, the ones which are slightly shorter, they will take all the tension, but the ones which are slightly longer will be slacker. But as time goes by, the ones which are taking all the tension, they stretch, and then the other ones which are slightly slacker start to kick in. And eventually they come to all more or less the same tension, which is when you get the best sound. Yes, of course. I'm sorry, I don't see you very well.
It's fine.
Yeah.
It's such an honor to hear you live. I've been listening to your music since I was a teenager. My question is, as somebody who has studied this music deeply, several different traditions, what is your own approach in teaching, I'm sorry, using these general words, improvisation and composition in your workshops?
Right.
Develop your own model, or you are still relying on the traditional models?
Well, let's put it this way. I shall tell you a rather funny story before I say this, because you said you've been listening to it since you were very young. A couple of summers ago, Kelly and I were on a boat going to another island. And I just went to the canteen to go and get a couple of coffees for us. And a very, very old lady, about 85 years old, came up to me and said, Mr. Daly, I like your music. I've been listening to you since I was a little girl. And get away from us. Yeah, but no, you're much younger, so that's quite okay coming from you. Much younger than me. Yeah. So my own approach to that is, well, we have this thing which we've come to know as world music. It's a rather dangerous term, actually, that. And it's been the cause of many misunderstandings. There is a world full of music, yes, but there is not one world music, no. And many things which have occurred within the genre which has come to be known as world music in recent years Some of them are quite interesting, and some of them are indeed meetings between different cultures and different people of different cultures. That's very important. And many things are a sort of a rather taste the soup in which all sorts of things are just thrown in rather haphazardly. That's something we have to watch out for. Where we live on Crete, we live in a village in the mountains. It's about 20 kilometers south of the capital city. Down the road from us is another village, about 13 kilometers down the road. And in that village lives a very, very famous singer, a very, very good singer. I've worked with him for about 35 years now. He sings a very specific style, and it's specific to his village. And somebody from a village 30 kilometers down the road would not dare to sing that repertoire, just as he would not like to sing the repertoire of the other village 30 kilometers down the road. Things are that specific. So, when you're inside that particular tradition, you start to hear very big and significant differences between the one and the other. When you're on the outside, and many people will say to us who maybe come from Athens or from the north of Greece, Cretan singers, they all sound the same. They all sound exactly the same. Well, that's not true to us. Something which somebody may say that they all sound the same, well, the one from the other may sound to us as different as Frank Sinatra, the Pavarotti, or something like that. And take the example of flamenco. How many people would say that, well, flamenco players, the flamenco singers, they all sound the same, you know? But it's not true. If you're inside the tradition, you start to hear huge differences. So we do have to bear in mind that regionality is very, very important, and that within the different traditions, there are very, very specific things. And so we have to be aware of that. That doesn't mean that we have to always do that, but we should be aware of it, and we should understand it. What happens often in various so-called world music projects is that people don't actually understand the differences between the one and the other, or they have a sort of a smattering of knowledge, just a rough idea of what's going on in one particular tradition. They just sort of copy that. Well, that won't really work. You do have to have a deeper understanding. So, my own teacher, what did he do? When I was first studying Lyra with Kostas Mundakis on Crete, initially he would make me copy everything he played as exactly as possible. This was a process which lasted 4 or 5 years, in which I would have to sort of copy very, very exactly everything he played. And I was not allowed to do it in my own way or anything. No, it had to be exactly copied as the way he did it. Okay, great. So I did that for 4 or 5 years. And when I got to be reasonably good at it, he then said, okay, stop that now. Now it's time we have to start looking for your sound. And so then a whole new process starts, which means that I have to start finding my sound. Okay, but to find my sound, I may be playing a Cretan lyra, okay, I may be even playing Cretan music on it, but my sound cannot be the same as his sound, or the same as my other friend over here, his grandfather's sound, or something like that. No, my sound would have to incorporate what is in my musical world, and that would be true of any person, really. So then the whole question of so-called authenticity starts to arise. There are many people in the world of traditional music in all parts of the world who are very, very concerned with what they refer to as authenticity. But even authenticity is always relative. It's relative to a specific moment in time or to a specific region. So what is authentic today cannot be the same as what was authentic 50 years ago or 50 years in the future. So each musician today has to find his own way to negotiate through all of this musical landscape in which he finds himself. And the prime thing which is necessary is coherence. How often do we hear music in which we see disparate elements coming from different directions which just don't seem to fit together? They seem to sound rather strange. So this is the difficulty. On Crete we also have an old folk tale which I find rather interesting, and I find it related to this particular subject. It's said, this is what the tale says, that if a young person wishes to learn the lira, they have to take their instrument with the bow and go at dusk to a crossroads, and with the bow etch a circle at the crossroads and sit inside it. Something similar to the legend which they say about learning the blues as well, with the crossroad. But anyway, this is what they say. You go to the crossroad and you etch a circle on the ground and you sit inside it with your instrument, and then night descends. Well, when it's dark, demons appear outside the circle. And what you know is that they are the best lira players. But you also know that you must not step outside the circle, otherwise you'll be eaten by them. So, they'll do everything they can to try and entice you to come out of the circle. But you must stay there, and then when they realize that you cannot be convinced to come out of the circle, they say, okay, give us the lira so we can play. So you give them the instrument outside the circle, and one by one, all night, they play, and they're the very, very best lira players, so you have to listen carefully, because that's your lesson. You listen carefully all night to what they're playing, and you try and remember as much as possible. Then in the morning, they have to disappear as day breaks. But before they disappear, you have to put the tip of your little finger outside the circle, which they eat as their payment. And then they disappear. And then you go back to your house, you go back to your own life with your instrument, and you try and remember what you learned that night from them. Okay, that's a nice, quaint little folk tale. I see it in the following way. The circle represents our individual existence as people in this life, and the demons outside the circle are like the entirety of the timeless tradition, so to speak. It's another realm. But we're in this life, in this moment, as who we are, individual people. So, of course, if you step outside your individual existence, you're eaten by the demons. You no longer exist. But you're inside your circle. You're inside your individual existence as a person today. But you're taking everything you can from this realm of the demons, and taking it inside your circle and working with it in your own way. The symbolic payment is a symbolic gesture that, yes, I too now belong to this world, and when my time on this earth is finished, I will go there as well. But for the time being, I have to be in my circle. I have to work with all the information I take from these demons inside my own individual circle here, and that's what I can do. So for me, this is rather interesting, because it means that just copying tradition of the past and not doing anything of your own with it, just sort of copying what has been given to you from the past, is really the equivalent of stepping outside the circle and being eaten by the demons. You don't actually exist. You have to be in your circle. You have to be in your individual existence. You have to be who you are, using all this material in a creative manner as best you can. And we know one day when your whole process and your whole life is finished, you too will belong to this realm of the demons, fine, okay? But for the time being, you have to be there within that circle. So I find that story quite relevant, actually, to the process of the interaction of the individual with tradition. That each one of us has to be who we are. Quite often tradition is used in a very imposing manner, that you have to be true to this, you have to do that, you must not betray it, you must not do this. And it's used in a very restrictive manner, whereas it should be a body of collective knowledge coming from the past, which comes into the present, which is then can be used as the foundation or the source material for contemporary creation, which then goes into the future. So I always encourage students, especially of composition, to study in as much depth as possible whatever tradition is of interest to them. And the more you know about it, the more you will be guided by your love for it and not be restricted by impositions which other people would seem to imagine that are necessary in order for you to be authentic. So that's how I would approach it. I hope. Is that a good answer for you?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
I have another question.
Yeah.
But you know if I'm talking to you. You know, as a teacher, like I also teach, you know, modal music, let's say.
Oh, excuse me, what do you teach? I'm not,
I teach Persian music. I
Per-
mean, I teach other things, but I also teach Persian music.
yes. Uh-huh.
And, you know, like learning any of these traditions, basically, you know, need at least 15 years.
Yes.
Just learn the basics.
Mm-hmm.
One of the difficulties that I have right now with the students is that what is the future for them? You know, like I encourage them to study, you know, like this type of music in depth for 15 years.
Yes.
And I sometimes feel guilty that, you know, what's going to happen after that? You know, because especially these days, even in Iran when I travel, all the great musicians that I know, they're completely marginalized, you know, and it seems that you have to learn this music for years and years. At the end, the only way to survive it is to just play fusion music or like being this, you know, world music ensembles that you just, you know, like don't have like the same depth that, you know, of the music that somebody has studied for 20 years or 15 years. And I have this dilemma that what is your answer to that, to your students that, you know, of course I tell them, you know, the only way to love somebody is to just love them without any hope. But this hope, you know, sometimes is not easy to deal with for so many people.
I know the problem, yes. That, well, for a start, we live in a world today which puts a lot of emphasis, in many ways quite rightly, on the whole element of youth. Everything is for the youth, everything is for the young people, everything is, you know, we have pop music, which in the world of pop music, by the age of 25, you're basically finished. And everything seems to be catered to a very, very young age group. And this is a bit of a problem when you deal with musical traditions in which there is no such thing as a master younger than 40. Really, there is no answer to that question. I mean, I myself, when I was much younger and I was studying these different instruments and things, in those decades, we're talking about the 1960s and 70s, where it was not at all in any way fashionable to be studying this sort of stuff. And many people actually felt rather sorry for me. They thought there's something wrong with me. The poor man, you know, he seems quite intelligent, but there he is with these miserable little instruments sort of struggling away. What's he going to do with this, you know? And if anybody actually came up to me and said, you know, here you are studying all these instruments and this sort of stuff, this strange music, what are you going to do with all of that when, you know, one day? And my answer was sort of to hang my head and say, I don't know. And I didn't know. But I loved it so much that I couldn't not do it. So that is my answer really to anybody, is that there is no guarantee. There is no specific path to follow other than being so sort of in love with it and obsessed with it that you really cannot do without it. You have to be doing it. And I do have a belief, which may be wrong, may be right, who knows, but it's in my interest to believe it, that somebody who really loves something and does it with love and, you know, with dedication and with devotion, there is something which doesn't allow that person to, well, somehow there's something which looks after that person, and he finds his way somehow. And also, this is the tricky part. The people who do well. The people who seem to find their way are the ones who never ask that question. That's the tricky part of it. That as soon as some sort of self-doubt comes into it, or you start to wonder what I'm going to do with all of this and things, that's something which can actually cause you to lose your way. And it's very important to either be doing it without questioning it at all, or, well, I would say that's the only choice. Sorry, that's the only choice, is just to be doing it without questioning it. And somehow it'll work. There's no guarantee, but you have to be able to do that kind of a balancing act. That to be sort of with absolute certainty in a quagmire. So it's difficult, it's not easy. But yeah, I do believe that someone who's doing something with devotion, with love, and with respect, and with dedication, that they don't lose their way. Something happens, and they find their way. Okay, I hope that was satisfactory for you. Anybody else like to ask something? Okay, so like to play something, Kelly?
I'd also like to say that Ross and Kelly and Michael and Kev are playing tonight at Cassine, if you don't already know. 7 p.m.
Okay. So, we thank you very, very much for coming. It's been a pleasure to be here with you. And maybe we'll see you on Crete one day. Who knows? Thank you.